I mentioned before that I would like to do a couple times a year, give a message about money, about finances. So don't run out the door right now, okay? I want to do this a couple times a year because so often churches will only discuss money, will only discuss finances when they're struggling. If they can't pay the bills, well, we better have the pastor talk about money this week because we're struggling. Let's pass the plates around again, dig deep, kind of thing. Fortunately, we're not in that position today. Thank you so much for your faithful giving. We're not flush with cash. We don't have that big Joel Osteen money rolling in, but we are doing fine, and I want to thank you for your faithful giving to continue giving to our local church here. It is important for us to think about finances from a biblical perspective. It's really hard for us to think about finances biblically, frankly, just because we live in 21st century America. We spend our whole lives being told by everyone around us, acquire as much wealth and as much stuff as you can. Our value in society tends to be tied to how much stuff we have, how big our house is, how new our car is. In 1987, a movie called Wall Street came out. If you guys remember this, it had Michael Douglas, Charlie Sheen. One of the most famous lines from that movie is, "Greed is good." Greed is good. Now, I know in the movie they're mocking that position. They're making fun of that idea. They're showing the dangers of this lifestyle of greed and that do anything to get ahead attitude. But culturally, back in the 80s and today, this race to acquire as much wealth as possible really is the standard for most of us. And the truth is, when we look at it, capitalism is not a biblical economic system. Socialism and communism aren't biblical economic systems either. And I think there's an economic system within these pages, within this Bible, that is here. That if we truly followed it, we would probably have a pretty good society. But there's a couple problems with that idea. First, most people around the world don't believe the Bible is true. They follow other religions or no religion at all, and why are they going to participate in a biblical economic system? And I think the bigger reason is simply we're a fallen people. We're incapable of completely following what we're told to do in this text. I mean, we sit here and we argue about who our neighbor is all day long. How are we going to all agree on a godly system of economics? So if we can't transform global economics through a biblical system, let's talk about what we can do individually or on a smaller scale. Very often I'll hear people say, I want to go back to the early church. I want things to be the way they were just after Christ's resurrection, just at that time of the formation of the church, which I think is a laudable goal. The early church was small, it was close, it was also growing exponentially. Consider the day at Pentecost, the church in Jerusalem went from, a few dozen followers to several thousand in one day? But it's really not as simple as we want it to be sometimes. Because the quote-unquote early church, it could really be believers in Jerusalem, or in Ephesus, or in Thessalonica, or in Corinth, or in Philippi. Look at the names of most of Paul's letters. They're generally, most of them are letters to churches around the Mediterranean, because each of these different churches in these different towns face their own particular challenges. So what we probably mean by the early church is this group of disciples that were in Jerusalem that we read about in the first part of Acts. Acts chapter 2, verse 42 gives us the most basic function of a church. And if we can do that, we're probably doing things right. Acts 2:42 says, of those early believers, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. But the early believers also understood they couldn't neglect those who were in need. It wasn't just about the fellowship. It wasn't just about the apostles' teaching. It wasn't just about that little bit. There were other things they needed to do as well. So a few chapters later, in chapter 6 of Acts, we read about 7 disciples who were chosen to basically run the food program for the church. There were some widows who were not getting fed, And the church leaders, Peter and the other leaders said, guys, our job is to teach you about Jesus. We don't have the time right now to head up our food program, so we're going to pick 7 people who are qualified to do that, and you guys can do the food program. And that's what they did over in chapter 6 that you can read about. Let's circle back to our reading now for today in chapter 4. This section here tells us the attitude the early church had when it came to supporting one another. It says, all the believers were one in heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. This is probably the hardest thing for us as modern Christians to understand, at least modern Western Christians. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. How do we refer to the stuff that we use? This is my house. This is my car. This is my shovel. This is my computer. This is my shirt. These are my shoes. This is my lawnmower. Mine, 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 mine. And again, this just goes back to how we've been raised in our culture. I work hard for the things I have. But the early church didn't see it that way. What if we were able to see the things that we have not necessarily as ours, but as something that God has provided us to use? The wealth we have, however much it is, can we see that as something we've been given as stewards, not as owners? So what's the difference? What is the difference between a steward and an owner? Well, a steward means we have something that we're looking after, that we're taking care of. It isn't ours. We don't own it. So we use the term flight attendants today, but that evolved from the term stewardesses and stewards, right? They take care of us on a flight. They look after us. And on a normal flight, what do? They bring you drinks, and they bring you snacks, and they tell you to put your seat back up when we're getting ready to land, and put your tray table up, and that's what their job is, right? Not exactly. Because if something happens on that flight, if there's a medical emergency, if there's an emergency with the airplane, their job is to take care of the passengers. They treat the medical problem as best they can. If need be, they evacuate the plane. Hopefully it's on the ground at that point. So as we think about all this, the stuff that we have, all this stuff, do we view it as our stuff, or do we view it as something God has provided us to take care of for the glory of the one who gave it to us? The message today really isn't so much about finances. It's not going to be about giving or tithing. It's about our mindset when it comes to the things that we have. Thinking again about the early church, all the believers were in one heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. Again, people often say they want to go back to the early church. Now, in Jerusalem, at least, they very much did live in community. They did most everything together. They took care of each other. And some people will get the idea, hey, we should do that now. And there are some groups that have done that, and it's worked out fairly well for them. Think about communities like the Hutterites or the Mennonites, the Amish. Now, there's, of course, positives and negatives to that lifestyle, but they've been around for a while, and it seems like they've figured out this community life that works for them. But then you get groups where it really, really doesn't work. Groups that claim to be centered on Christ, but in reality are centered on a person. They're centered on their leader. I have 2 examples, and they've probably already come to mind for you. The first is the People's Temple, Jim Jones, Jonestown. Back in 1978, if you don't remember this story, this group of Jim Jones followers moved to French Guiana, I believe it was. Guyana. I'm from North Dakota, I say Guyana. So, they moved to South America. We cool with that? All right. They moved to South America, And Jim Jones was a bit of a nut, to say the least. Long story short, there was a mass suicide, mass murder, however you want to call it. Over 900 people died in that event in 1978. About 30 years ago, there was an event in Waco, Texas. I'm sure a lot of us remember that quite clearly. The Branch Davidians, David Koresh was their leader. A 1993 siege resulted in the deaths of 76 people there. Again, a group that tried to separate from culture, tried to separate from society, and it just did not work out. Now, I do have a theory, aside from this centered on Jesus versus centered on a person thing, as to why some groups work and why others wind up in tragedy. Are you ready for my theory? Big, goofy sunglasses. Think about it. Jim Jones, big, goofy sunglasses. David Koresh, big, goofy sunglasses. Have you ever seen an Amish guy walking around with big, goofy sunglasses? I rest my case. The early church really lived in this tight-knit community out of necessity. They were small. Even after Pentecost, even when their numbers grew into the thousands, this is still a small religious group. They were persecuted. Their leader, Jesus, had been crucified for preaching what they were now trying to practice. You combine these things, it means that they were scared. Understandably, they were scared. So they lived in community. They protected one another. They took care of one another. They made sure that no one went without. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all, that there were no needy persons among them. God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. How were they able to accomplish this? How can they accomplish no needy people among them? Well, it goes on. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. So the idea and the action, right? We have an idea and we have an action. They didn't view their possessions as their possessions. They shared what they had. And if they needed to, they sold what they had so that no others would go without, so that the others around them would get what they needed. Well, wait a minute. That sounds a little woke there. That sounds a little from each according to his need to each according to his ability here. Little Marxist, little socialist, little communist. Sounds like what these progressives want to do here. I don't think my voice can get much higher than this. Man, you can't even trust the Bible anymore, can you? My economics teacher in high school, way back in the previous century, back in the dark days of the 1900s, my economics teacher, it was last millennium, guys, think about it. My economics teacher said that Jesus was a communist. It's like, okay, there's a few things wrong with that statement that I'm going to address here. Number one, communism wasn't a thing at the time of Christ. Number two, communism is inherently atheistic, and Jesus isn't going to promote something or be something that is absent of God. And within communism or Marxism or socialism, the wealth redistribution thing is not voluntary. It's accomplished through a central, powerful government. And what Jesus promoted and what the early disciples practiced was a system of wealth redistribution. They did. It's right there. That's what they're saying. I sold a piece of land. I gave it to the church so that people could eat. That's what it is. But it is a willing system. It is a willing system. It seems whenever we talk about money, we always come back to the story of the man who comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, what do I need to do to be perfect? Jesus says, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, honor your father and mother, love your neighbor. And the man's response is, great, I've done all of that. Cool. What else do I need to do? And what does Jesus tell him? He says, go and sell everything you have and give the money to the poor. And the man goes away sad because he was so rich. He didn't want to sell his things. And whenever we talk about this story, we're always really quick to say this is an individual command, which it is. This applies only to this one man and not to all of us. This is not a universal command that all of us are required to follow. God may call on you to do this, but it is not a general requirement. In other words, guys, go ahead and keep what you got. It's okay. Yet, it would seem that the early church was doing exactly this thing. They're selling what they have when they see someone in need. They sell what they have so they can help this person. They sell their property and give the proceeds to the apostles, to the leaders of their church community, so that money can be given to those in need. And now, looking back on this, 2,000 years ago, it's really easy for us to be cynical and go, oh, really? Did they? Really? They sold their property and gave their money away? Are you kidding? Really? I don't think they really shared everything they had. But then to prove that it's not simply anecdotal, it's not just a story, Luke gives us an example of someone doing this. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. Barnabas does this. He sees the need in his community and he does something about it. He sells a field he owns and gives the money, all the money, to the church to be given to those in need. A couple of things to note here. Number one, he sold a field he owned. It doesn't say he sold everything. He sold some of what he had. But the other thing here, too, is it says he gives it, and Luke says he puts it at the apostles' feet. He lets them distribute it the way they see fit. Once we give a gift, once we give to charity or to an individual, once we give a gift, we're finished. We've done the right thing. We no longer have a claim on what happens with that gift. How often, though, do we think about giving with conditions? I know I've talked about this before. We'll see somebody on the street corner asking for money, and our initial thought is, boy, I would love to help that person. I'd love to give them $5 or $10, but I don't know if they're going to spend it on alcohol or on drugs or on cigarettes. I'm fine if they buy food, but I don't want them to spend it on something bad. Here's the thing. Once we give our gift, our part is over. We've done the right thing. What that person does, what that organization does with it, is now up to them to do the right thing. Barnabas saw a need in his community. He did the right thing, and he helped those in need. And if we keep reading in Acts, just a few more verses after this story, we get an example of giving the wrong way. You may be familiar with the story of Ananias and Sapphira. They too sold a piece of property. They too laid the money at the apostles' feet, but they kept back a little bit of the proceeds from that sale for themselves. Barnabas gave everything. Ananias and Sapphira give much of it, but they keep some of it for themselves. However, they tell the apostles what they're giving is everything they got for the sale of their property. They lie. They lie to the apostles. They lie to the church. They lie to God. And what happens? Peter calls them out. First to Ananias. Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to human beings, but to God. And at this, Ananias falls down dead. Holy cow. Some people take him off to bury him, and Sapphira comes back. Luke doesn't tell us where she was. Maybe she was out at Aldi or something. I don't know. Just 3 hours later, she comes in, and she has no idea what happened. And Peter asked her, "Tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land?" "Yes," she said, "that is the price." She has a chance to tell the truth, but she doesn't. Peter said to her, How could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also." At that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. Now, if I were more of a scummy prosperity gospel preacher, if I was like, my name was Jim Baker, maybe, I might stand here and I might say, look at this story. They were struck down because they held back from God. They kept for themselves what they were supposed to give to God, and God struck them down for it. Now pass those plates around again. Fill them back up. Save yourselves. I'm glad you're laughing. I really am. I'm really glad you realize I'm joking. That's good. Of course, that's not why Ananias and Sapphira were struck down. They weren't struck down because they kept some of what they had. They were struck down because they lied to God. They said this was everything they had to give. And if they had told the truth, I think they would have been fine. We sold some land. Here's most of it, but we had some debt we had to pay off with it over here as well. Great. Guys, I get it. We work all week long, 40 hours a week or more for most of us. We work hard. I've had jobs that are physically draining. At the end of an 8, 10, 12-hour days, your body feels the work you did. You feel the money that you earned. I've had jobs that are mentally draining. Sitting at a desk for 8 or 12 hours can be exhausting as well. When I worked as a dispatcher for the ambulance service in Fargo, 12 hours sitting there knowing something's going to happen and having to be ready for that, but not knowing what it is or when it's going to happen. Some nights I could sit there and watch 2 or 3 movies. Great. Other nights we had so many calls that my brain couldn't handle it. And there was always something going on. We work hard for what we have. No one is saying we don't. But as believers, we need to understand we have another job to do. We have a greater calling. The things we have, the things God has entrusted us with, must be used to better the lives of those around us. Now, if you're not a Christ follower, you don't have to do this. You could, but there's no mandate. Don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. If you do claim Jesus as your Lord and Savior, this is a requirement. To take what God has given us to support others so that they are not in need. And there is reward for this, for helping others. There is reward for helping others. You might not gain more financially, you might not gain more materially, maybe you will. But the great reward really is the satisfaction we get when we are blessed to help. Don't raise your hand, but how many of you feel lost? Maybe all the time or some of the time you feel lost. You feel empty. You feel like there's something missing in your life. You feel like there's this hole in your heart that needs to be filled with something. Now, some will fill it with bad things like drugs or alcohol or promiscuity. Some look to fill that hole in their heart with any religion that isn't Jesus. They've been so turned away from what Christians portray sometimes that they think Jesus is bad. And they look for anything and everything that's out there to fill that void. But none of those things can fill that void. Only Jesus can. Only Jesus can fill that void. Becoming a Christ follower may not fix everything in your life. Guarantee it. If you're struggling with mental health issues, you can still have depression. You can still have anxiety or whatever else, even if you're a faithful Christ follower. But Jesus can fill that void. Following Jesus, following his calling on your life, doing the things he calls on you to do, on all of us to do, can truly bring meaning to us. Do you want to follow Jesus today? I can't tell you that your life will become perfect if you surrender to Christ. Frankly, things may become more difficult, more confusing, for a while at least. But surrendering to Jesus and following him can bring value to who you are. Turn to Jesus now. Turn to Jesus now. Let him fill that void that's in your heart.